Afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States. Good evening if you are in Teddington in the United Kingdom. Hello, as always, to our beloved ones in the Ukraine. Stay strong. We love you. We're with you. And greetings to people all around the world. Today is December 16th of 2022. And this is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is an audio and video streaming service dedicated to serving artists and bringing opera and classical music to people all around the world who love opera and classical music. And I would add, music by great composers we may not necessarily call classical, but who merit discussion. And one of them is someone we're going to talk about today. December 16th is the birthday of Noël Coward, who was born in Teddington near London on December 16th, 1899, and he died in Jamaica in 1973. And I have two guests today, two wonderful guests. One of them is Jonathan Bank, a person I've admired for many, many years, although I don't think he knew that, who runs a theater. He's the producing artistic director of the Mint Theater in New York City, about which we will talk. And then we have Alexander Lass joining us from London, who directed the first Noël Coward play to be done at the Mint Theater in New York, just very recently. It closed this week after its scheduled run. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And Jonathan, I'd like to start with you, because what I'm about to ask you, I don't know the answers myself. The Mint Theater, in my view, is a genuine New York treasure. I don't think in London, which is a place I spent a lot of time in, I've encountered a theater quite like it. It's a theater that describes its mission as lost plays found here. And I would say that many, though not all of the plays, are ones that are from the English, Scottish, Irish, or American tradition, primarily, but not only, from about a century ago. Is that accurate?
More or less. I mean, the century ago is a little narrow because there are probably more plays from 110 years ago than from 100 years ago. But,
okay. But tell me, I know the theater was founded in 1992, so it's now 30 years old, and you joined the theater in 1995. Why was it founded? Why is it called the Mint Theater? And when you took over, talk about a lot of the work you've done. Well, we can talk about some of the playwrights that you've introduced to our audiences. But number one, the mission of the theater, and also why is it called the Mint?
Well, I'm going to have to evade or disappoint on some of these questions. The theater was founded in 92. I actually became involved before 95, but it was founded by Kelly Morgan, who I went to graduate school with in Cleveland, Ohio, at Case Western Reserve. And he gave it its name and he gave it its mission. I kept the name, but I threw out his mission, which was very broad and general. And really it was intended in its early days to serve his students. He was an acting teacher. And the mission kind of evolved, and the programming it evolved over between 95, 96 and 2000, at which point I just committed to the idea of the neglected play. So I think the original mission statement used the word mint. Plays that were in mint condition, keeping the classics in mint condition and minting new plays, something along those lines. When I took over the company, one of the first things I did, and this probably tells you all you need to know about me, was I got out the Oxford English Dictionary and I looked up the word mint. So, you know, that we'd already had the name for a number of years, and I needed to I didn't want to abandon it. I didn't but I needed to make it my own. I needed to come to my own understanding of it, and I found, definition number 602 or whatever it was, was to aim at or to aspire. And the quote that was used as a demonstration of that meaning was something along the lines of, "Those that aim at a gown of gold will surely get a sleeve of it." And I thought, there you go, good enough for me. So that's, but I think Kelly had something else in mind with Mint, and I can't tell you what it was.
Okay. Was your background in Case Western one of being a dramaturg, a scholar on theater? Did you have a particular interest in a particular area of theater, or did you go all the way back to the Greeks and move forward?
Well, I at Case Western Reserve, working on my Master of Fine Arts degree, I was an actor. I was but I was an aspiring director in a program that didn't teach directing, and for personal and complicated reasons, I was going to school at, where I grew up in Cleveland, and so I took what they had, and never was a particularly good actor because I was always paying attention to things outside of what should have been outside of my circle of concentration.
Mm-hmm.
So I was not a dramaturg or really a student of dramatic literature. And the reason you haven't asked me this question, maybe should just let you ask me the questions instead of.
No, this is a conversation, not an interview.
Well, the reason, what drew me to the neglected play was two things, particularly. One, as a hopeful director, I knew that I wasn't a clever director. Mm-hmm. That my production of Hamlet wasn't going to be, centered around some fantastic idea. I was a storyteller, but I was, as I think directors mostly are, although some maybe are or go past this, but I was an interpretive artist, not a creative artist. A conductor, not a composer, perhaps. So understand, but mostly I was wanted to be a storyteller, and that meant two things. One, it meant plays that actually had a plot, that were, narrative driven, and the other thing it meant was that if you want the audience focused on the story or on the play and not on the cleverness of the director, then the engine that will drive that is the narrative and the narrative structure and the question of, what do you think she'll do? How will this relationship resolve? How will will they find the thing, whatever it is. And if you already know the answer to that, then you have to wonder whether the director is going to find a clever way to tell that story. But if you don't know the answer to that, you can just relax and be told the story. So I wanted plays that most writers are not writing these days, mm-hmm. with a kind of Aristotelian conventional narrative structure with a climax, etc. And I wanted people to be experiencing the story for the first time, so that they might wonder what's going to happen. And that
And
meant to place.
clearly you've done lots of research. Obviously, there have been writers, I'm not going to say playwrights, but writers such as Ernest Hemingway, Martha Gellhorn, and playwrights such as Lillian Hellman, whose names are known. But then there have been many writers and playwrights whose works you have in effect unearthed for us. And how do you set about finding a play that perhaps we don't know? I should tell listeners that when you go to a production at the Mint Theater, there are billboards and signage and lots of scholarship and wonderful essays and books that are published and so on. And it is very much a learning experience beyond just a night at the theater. And that's part of what I cherish about the Mint Theater, is that I learn so much when I go there. And there are very few theaters in New York that have that component. To some degree, the Irish Rep does, to some degree, Signature does. But I think that the Mint is the gold standard for this kind of engagement with a play, in addition to the actual play that we're seeing. So talk about your mining for the gold.
Well, in the early days, the back in the 90s and early aughts, I think the way I found plays at first was quite simple and maybe instructive. There were, if there are anthologies, published in 1926 that says great plays of the century, or and sometimes it's, maybe the period is finite, but so here's an anthology that purports to have, a list of great plays, and I go through the contents, table of contents, and you go, oh, I recognize half of these titles and the other half I don't recognize. And it was really easy for me to conclude that at the time that the editor was picking these 15 plays, he didn't say, here are the 5 that are going to last forever, and here's another 10 that will become dated, by the time the book is out of print. And so I thought, so they were all equals in one moment. And what if I read the ones I'd never heard of? I mean, and so, you say mining for gold, but it's hardly even panning for gold. I mean, it's right there. It's in a book that somebody said, here are golden plays, and it's just that I was willing to read plays that I'd never heard of. And I think this is, in some ways, the kind of the life lesson of the Mint Theater Company is, I mean, my, super objective is to cause you to question the conventional wisdom of, if I haven't heard of it, it must not be any good. The kind of belief that whoever the gatekeepers are, in culture, are actually passing through only the worthy. So
I understand in my work in opera, I similarly go digging for works not only by famous composers, because Donizetti wrote more than 75 operas, and many of them are treasures, but they just have not passed the muster of the people who seem to be in power. And so maybe 8 or 9 of his operas are done. Verdi wrote 27, 28 operas, depending who you ask. There are still Verdi operas that need to be done, and they're very, very seldom done. Mm-hmm. And Mozart wrote 22. We basically see 7 or 8. Right. So those are just 3 examples of many. Before we get to Noël Coward, I would like to just ask you, Jonathan, there have been many wonderful playwrights who you have brought to us. 2 that I noted in my recent going to your theater is Harley Granville Barker and Teresa Deevy. Would you like to talk about one of them?
Sure. Harley Granville Barker is not the one I'm going to talk about, because
Okay.
really, you know, I think lots of people in the theater know who he is, but Teresa Deevy is a rare instance of my finding a playwright because I was looking for her. And I was looking for her in the sense that I thought that I recognized that I could not name an Irish woman writing plays after Lady Gregory in the first 50 years of the Abbey Theatre Company. And when I say after Lady Gregory, well, the old lady, you know, Lady Gregory was one of the founders of the company, and you know, a great model that might have been followed by many women. You know, and it struck me as unlikely that there weren't others, but I couldn't name one.
Mm-hmm.
So I got out a production history, you know, a catalog of all the plays that have been produced at the Abbey, you know, from founding to 1950 to the burning of the original building. And I just made a list of names. And if you were writing, if a woman was writing under a pseudonym or using initials, you know, I missed them. I was only looking for, you know, kind of the obvious gendered names, the Marys and the Catherines and the Teresas, and I came, and also I wanted somebody's name to appear multiple times. So if it was just once, that, you know, that wasn't going to satisfy me. But if there were multiple entries, and I had a list, I think at the end of my scrolling, I mean, I was actually turning pages, but not scrolling, but of, I think, 8 names. And yeah, you know, I just put each one into a search engine. And the problem is it you know, so many of the names actually, I mean, if you're Catherine O'Neill, I mean, you know, finding Catherine O'Neill, the Abbey playwright, is really, really difficult, because there are so many hits that return on Catherine O'Neill. But Teresa Deevy had 6 plays produced at the Abbey in the course of 6 years, and I was actually able to, she had been published, and that one publication was in circulation at the New York Public Library, so I could actually get up from my desk and, you know, and ride down to the library and take a book out. And you know, the interesting thing, Fred, is that once I started doing my research, I found, so she was writing in the 30s, 1930 to 1936 is when she was an Abbey playwright. She continued for another 10 years, 20 years actually, as a working writer, but never again for the Abbey. But I found a quote in the Irish Times in the 70s saying, you know, Ireland's greatest neglected playwright, you know, so, you know, I was really only discovering her again after she'd been forgotten, you know, so she was discovered in the 70s, forgotten again, rediscovered. And that's why when you know, I've done 4 productions of her plays over the course of 8 years. And that was part of the plan, was that you have to stick at it.
So I want to get to Noël Coward, but then I do want to get back a little later to the Mint because
Sure.
I care about it. How did it come to pass that the Mint, after 30 years, finally, that's a judgmental word. How did it come to pass that the Mint undertook to produce a play by Noël Coward?
Well, that story begins with Alex sending it to and asking me to look at it. So
Then let me ask Alex.
So I discovered the play. Well, I say discovered. I read the play in 2018. I was doing a similar kind of thing to what Jonathan has described in the way he's found plays for the Mint. I was sitting in the London Library in St James's Square here in London, looking for plays that might be of interest, might be intriguing to consider, plays that either had never been done before or hadn't been done for a very long time. I was looking mainly at plays that by known writers rather than unknown writers. I found the published copy of 3 plays by Coward, which featured The Rat Trap, The Vortex, and This Happy Breed. Intriguingly, the Rat Trap was published in 1924 before it had been produced. It wasn't produced in London until 1926. So I found this play, read it, was very excited by it, the themes, the characters, Coward's brilliant use of language, and I couldn't believe that it hadn't been done in London since 2006. I
point out, Alex, that 2006 was the first production after 26. So.
Quite right. 2006 was the second ever production of the play, the first ever revival at the Finborough in London, which I didn't see. But I thought it was definitely worthy of another look, and sent it to some theatres here in London, but also sent it to Jonathan. And I knew Jonathan a little bit because in 2014, I came to the Mint to assist Davis McCallum on a production of London Wall by John Van Druten.
Which I saw, yeah.
Which was a lovely production. Yeah. And I have an affinity with the mission of the Mint because I trained at a theatre here in London called the Orange Tree in Richmond, which was founded by Sam Walters, and Sam ran it for 42 years, and I was one of Sam's penultimate trainee directors at the Orange Tree 2012 to 13, and was quite taken with one strand of the work that he did there, which was very similar to Jonathan's in rediscovering forgotten plays.
Sam and I became friendly, and we got to know each other after we had already each kind of overlapped on, I think, about 10 plays.
The Rat Trap, Alex, start with the title. I know why, because I saw the play and read the notes, but I'd rather you explain why.
Why it's called The Rat Trap?
Yes.
So the play centers around a young couple, an aspiring novelist and an aspiring playwright, who get married. And the play was written in 1919, so it doesn't actually specify when it's set, but we took it to be set in and of at the time that it was written. So 1919, 1819, they get married, and the play examines whether 2 ambitious, creative individuals can both have successful independent careers, or does one person in a marriage or a partnership need to subjugate themselves for the marriage? And basically, does one person need to be the support while the other person has the career? And the idea, the hope of these 2 newlywed artists is that they will both have their careers, they will support each other equally, and they will both work very hard at their respective creative pursuits. And unfortunately, and perhaps inevitably, we could say that stereotypical gender roles are adhered to, or things kind of fall out in such a way that Sheila Brandreth, the aspiring novelist, ends up subjugating herself, her personality, and her career in support of her husband and his playwriting. And the Rat Trap refers to the toxic situation that they find themselves in their marriage disagreeing, arguing, not seeing eye to eye, and ultimately, yeah, that's how the title kind of connects.
Well, I think it's important to point out that Noël Coward wrote this when he was 19 years old.
Yes.
Do we have any idea how he came to understand this? I know that his mother was a writer. His father was a not very successful piano salesman. He wrote it as Britain was ending its engagement in the First World War. There were all kinds of questions about what would follow. He was a teenager. And
He was.
And yet it's remarkably sophisticated. And I don't mean when we think of sophisticated Noël Coward, we think of dressing gowns and that stuff, but it's sophisticated about human relations. And yes, we may certainly say that he had a genius, but nonetheless, certainly Mozart had certain kind of human understanding at 19. I don't think Rossini did, although Rossini wrote masterpieces by then, but they were musical masterpieces. And other prodigies who were writing about the human condition, whether in theater, novels, or opera, don't necessarily show the degree of knowledge of human behavior that so struck me in this play. I don't know if either of you have feelings on that topic.
I think, I mean, you're right to, it's interesting because he was a prodigy, clearly, and we're not accustomed to kind of a prodigy. So music, while music is certainly driven by emotion, it's also driven by math, and and the idea of a chess prodigy or a math prodigy, that that's easy to comprehend. But the idea of having a prodigious or a premature or a precocious kind of understanding of the dynamics of human relationship is really hard to point to another instance of it. He probably, I think, and Alex, you'll agree or disagree, but I think we talked about this. It's clear that he can relate to all of the characters in the play. And so, maybe what was prodigious was not his understanding of how human relationships work, but of his own feelings, of his own conflicting emotions.
Alex?
Yes, I think I agree with that. And there doesn't seem to be, there's no sort of evidence, shall we say, hard evidence that Jonathan or I could discover that gives us any clues into sort of how he came to write the play. He didn't keep a journal at that time, or if he did, we don't have the access to it, or we haven't been able to find it in our research. What we know of what Coward thought of the play, we know retrospectively from writings that he wrote about it in his autobiography, one of his autobiographies, Present Indicative, when he talks about the play as, the first time he thought he could write plays, and he was very pleased with the psychological reality of the major scene in Act 2, but he also thought the ending was very unsatisfactory, and he himself didn't kind of advocate and champion for it himself in his own life. And he kind of considered it as a piece of juvenilia that wasn't necessarily worthy of much attention. But it really does seem to show a extraordinary precociousness and an insight, whether it's into his own feelings, his own understanding of the world, and how he maps that on to his characters. But linking it to music, if I may, we put in the scenic transition between Acts 1 and 2, and maybe you were going to come on to this anyway, Fred, but we covered the scenic transition in the production with Forbidden Fruit, a song that Coward wrote the music and the lyrics to in 1916 when he was 16 years old. And that was the first song that he wrote, a full-length song that he wrote the music and the lyrics to. And I'll just read you a few of the lyrics here, because again, it shows an extraordinary understanding of human relationships. Ordinary man invariably sighs vainly for what cannot be. If he's in an orchard, he will lift his eyes up into the highest tree. There may be a lot of windfalls lying all around, but you'll never find a man enjoy the fruit that's on the ground. Every peach out of reach is attractive because it's just a little bit too high, but you'll find that every man will try to pluck it if he can as he passes by. For the brute loves the fruit that's forbidden, but I'll bet you £5 he'll appreciate the flavour of it much, much more if he has to climb a bit to shake it down.
It's wonderful.
And this is a 16-year-old boy writing this.
Yeah. I want to mention for our listeners, many of whom come here from around the world, often expecting musical conversations, that Coward had at least 14 different careers that I could count. And one of them was he was a very fine composer, very famous for his songs, and he almost always wrote the lyrics, but he wrote musicals and he wrote operettas. And the Adagio catalog, and I've provided a link to all the Coward recordings on the catalog, has wonderful performances by opera singers and by non-opera singers of a lot of this repertory. So that's something you can dig into. Alex, there are other characters in the play, and to me, they were as fascinating in their ways. They're not as prominent as the two leads, who are Sheila and Keld, but they're sort of, let's call them a bohemian couple, for lack of a better term, Naomi and Edmund, who I very much enjoyed. They then have a friend, or actually Sheila has a friend named Olive. And to my understanding, Olive was a journalist or a gossip columnist. I wasn't quite sure what kind of journalism she practiced, but what struck me was the three leading characters in the play were writers. And there are not that many plays I can think of that have three writers in the play. Would you talk about these surrounding characters before we get to Burrage?
Yes. So you're quite right, Fred, to point out that Coward really does have an interest in the artistic temperament and in the creative process and what it is to be a creative artist. And as you rightly point out, in the Rat Trap, the four central characters are writers in various forms, and he seems to have an interest in what that means in terms of how they behave, but also you could see it as a rather clever way to justify his interest in and manipulation of language, because first and foremost his plays are about the brilliance, the wit, the sharpness of his language. And he has been criticized over the years, with some justification, for being style over substance by some scholars and some critics, and that the wit and the froth and the humor of the lines, if you dig underneath, it's not substantial enough. Now, I personally disagree with that opinion, but certainly in the play, in the Rat Trap, because you have a novelist and a playwright as the central characters, you have a poet and another novelist. Naomi is a novelist, and Edmund Crowe, her partner, is a poet, a sort of failed poet. And Olive starts the play as a writer who's also not very successful in the chosen form of writing that she wants to do, fiction, I think, short stories, novellas, novels. And then she becomes a gossip columnist as a second career. She sort of falls into it and gets much success. So I think Coward is also making a point there about the different forms of writing. And I think he is a bit hierarchical about it. I think he is trying to say that being a novelist or being a playwright is in some senses a higher caliber pursuit than some of the other forms, and because he himself was this polymathic genius at so many different forms, you could argue that he has permission to take this view because he wears so many hats himself to huge success. Does that answer the question?
Yes, Alex, you happened to be there the night that I attended. And just so both of you and our audience knows, I had planned to do a Noël Coward program on this day, on December 16th, for about 6 months. It's also Beethoven's birthday, and I could have done that, but I do that most years. And I thought, let me go back to Noël Coward, who I greatly admire. So I already had that in mind before I knew that the Mint was doing the Rat Trap. But when I discovered that you were doing it, that's how both of you came to be invited as my guests, assuming that I would have loved the production, and I did. And Alex, that evening, I asked you a question that I was glad to have asked you, and I'd like to restate it here and have you talk about it here, because I think it's very important as your answer. Namely, often Noël Coward plays, whether in London or Britain, but certainly in New York, are spoken at a rapid fire clip, kind of like Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell in the front page, that kind of thing, or His Girl Friday. And often to me, it's a plethora of consonants and vowels, and I can't quite grasp what people are saying. Your production, one of the many things I loved about it was people spoke at a normal pace, the way they might have in the 1920s. I don't know, I was not there, but it was actual conversation, and there were pauses, and people listened to one another and reacted to what they heard, rather than this rat-tat-tat-tat-tat of dialogue that one often hears. And I asked you about it, Alex, and you said that was a choice. How did you reach that choice? And I'm glad you did. And do you think that Coward's work suffers because it's often done in that, oh, darling, you look wonderful style, and not as a play?
Yes, absolutely. I think we were all really keen from the start, from early pre-production conversations that Jonathan and I had together, to conversations during the audition process, and then once we got the cast together and started rehearsals in earnest, was that we wanted to make it feel, for want of a better word, real. We wanted to make the relationships, the story, the lines, the dialogue, the situation feel like it could be happening now, even though we've set it in the past. We wanted it to feel relevant, current, believable. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's naturalistic. You know, there can be, don't want to get too philosophical, but there is a difference, I think, between realistic and naturalistic. Mm-hmm. And it is a high style. You can't deny it, and you can't. You have to embrace that Coward's writing is high style, but you can embrace it without indulging it, I think, and without letting it become too much. And it's about having that calibration between where the style remains in the realm of being real, and when it tips over into overacting or being indulgent, or, you know, relying on the fact that it's funny, so the audience are going to be laughing, so you can then get away with milking it. That was our guiding principle, was always to err on the side of keeping it real as much as possible. And Coward himself actually has a very fascinating and insightful TV interview that he did, which you can find on YouTube. If your listeners type in Noël Coward on acting, there's a brilliant recording of a TV interview he gave. It's about 40 minutes long, where he really goes into detail about his his ideas on acting and how it should be. And of course, when you watch older productions of Coward, even done by very, very famous actors, they do seem a bit over the top to us now, but that's partly because of the way acting styles and acting processes and reception to acting has changed over time. But he is very insightful about how the line should be spoken and how much of it is about timing, and how a great actor, a great comedian, a great actor is always engaged, having two things going on at once. They're engaging with their fellow actors on the stage and listening and reacting, but they're also engaging with the audience and the response that the audience are giving or not giving, and having an awareness of what the audience are doing and feeding that into the performance, albeit as subtly as possible.
I think there's another, if I may, Fred,
Yes,
another thing to consider here. Because, I mean, of course, The Rat Trap was a Coward play, but it was a Coward play that he never saw produced. And that he never heard a reading of, as far as I know, that he, you know, and to the and it's a Coward play that absolutely not only supported but demanded the kind of naturalism that Alex is talking about. And we did decide, I mean, we agreed that we wanted to prioritize the emotional, psychological conflict over the humor, if you know, you kind of want both, but certainly we felt that it was really important. And you know, it's going back to the title itself. At first I thought the biggest problem with the play is the title, and then I came to understand really that it was a gift. That it's not the mousetrap, it's the rat trap, and you know, it kind of gives you license, or perhaps demands, that you allow it to be ugly. And you know, the fight between Sheila and Kel, you know, is violent and frightening and brutal, and we certainly were aware of that. I think it's interesting, Fred. I mean, I'm not going to write a thesis on the topic, but if the play had been done when he wrote it and it had been well received, how would that have altered the course of his career? Because what happened is it was done, it rode on the coattails of frothier, funnier work. And so it failed to deliver the froth. And the bigger issue, or another issue that, you know, Alex referred to Present Indicative, written in the 30s, where he was, but the volume that Alex found, published in 24, he'd given up on the play. It was supposed to be produced in 23. That production was canceled for reasons that, you know, we don't need to discuss here, but that it never happened. And at the point that there was a publication of The Vortex and Fallen Angels, you know, you can say, can we stick in The Rat Trap too? Or they said, do you have something else you want to include? Whatever it was. But in the introduction to that volume, and I'm going to characterize this, you know, I have no right to do this, but I feel like he characterized it defensively. The play had not been done. And he said the moment for the play is past. And, you know, he didn't say, you know, what's wrong with the world? Why aren't you doing my good play? You know, he said, well, I wrote it when I was young. And he kind of explained why it hadn't been produced by taking by blaming the play as opposed to defending the play, and it's in some ways it's just kind of a function of timing. And I think that if in 1920 this play had been done before the vortex, before, you know, how would, and if it had been received as kind of stunningly brutal and acute and nuanced and sophisticated, you know, might he have followed a different path? Slightly, you know, might he have slightly?
I had not read the play before, so I came to it cold. One thing that struck me very strong in my own work in the opera world, I began in legit theater, so to speak, but I knew I was heading toward opera, but nonetheless have always retained a passion for plays and musicals and so on. And the two playwrights who most affected me were Ibsen and Shaw, which are not rarities, of course, but Ibsen for the naturalism, but also the moral issues, and Shaw for the wit, but also they were moral fables in his way. And I especially, more than Ibsen, which I didn't feel too much in the play, a little bit The Lady at the Sea and a couple of things, but really I felt Shaw in a very strong way. And not that Coward would be copying from Shaw, but Shaw was very much alive working. And do we know of any connection, either personal or in terms of influence of Shaw on Noël Coward?
There was interaction between them, and Shaw said to Coward, Alex, you may be able to quote this better than I'm not going to quote it at all, but the paraphrase was, "You should stay a mile away from me because, you know, I'll ruin you." But they did interact, and there was and Shaw, you know, when I say that, you know, there's a large body of work, you know, that's more than 100. It's all the influence of Shaw on plays from, you know, 1905 to 1918 is huge. I mean, and it continued on. But Harley Granville Barker, of course, was a Shaw acolyte and friend, and you mentioned him earlier. But Shaw, nobody would have you know, avoided the influence, the positive influence of Shaw.
Alex?
Yes, I think that's quite right. I was just quickly Googling to see if I could find it. There is definitely a quote, which is a sort of like a very witty, as you would expect, quote from Shaw to Coward. I can't quite find it at the moment, but it's there somewhere. I think what you find, it seems to me like the dramatists, these great dramatists of the 20th century, are often, as Jonathan says, acolytes or disciples, if not unofficially, if not necessarily officially, of some of the giants who come before. And certainly fast forwarding, when Noël Coward saw Pinter, early Pinter, and he wrote to Pinter saying, you know, this is a masterpiece, you know, ignore the critics, whether it was the birthday party or the homecoming. And, you know, Coward's take on Pinter was quite something as well. So you have these giants from, you know, from the past reaching down to the newcomers and either praising them or condemning them. I think there was some witty positive, but also perhaps a sort of put down from Shaw to Coward.
Well, he was
based on memory. Yes, Jonathan. Yeah,
I think he wanted to encourage Coward, and he did it, but it wasn't let me give you advice. It was, you know, because he did not. He felt. My recollection is that he felt that, you know, Coward had a clue, and that maybe trying to be more Shaw-like would be awful for him.
That was the relationship of Ravel and Gershwin, that Gershwin went to Ravel for advice and so on, and Ravel said, you just be George Gershwin and don't try to be Maurice Ravel. If
Right.
memory serves, and I could be wrong, so I'm not saying this is a certain statement, I know that Noël Coward gave £1,000 to help launch a Pinter play, and I think it was The Caretaker, but I'm not certain which. But I know that Coward did that because he admired Harold Pinter. So now something else about Coward moving forward. After The Rat Trap and some of his plays and musicals of the 20s, he had a string of hits, and I do want to find it in my notes, that was rather astonishing. And just like Giuseppe Verdi wrote 3 masterpieces in 3 years of Rigoletto, Trovatore, and Traviata in less than 3 years, Noël Coward in 1930 wrote Private Lives, Cavalcade in 1931, a little forgotten except that the film version won the Oscar for Best Picture in 1933, Designed for Living in 1932, Conversation Piece, which was an operetta in 1933, and Blithe Spirit came later in 1941. But those plays of Designed for Living, Cavalcade, and Private Lives form part of the canon that we think of as the Noël Coward typical play. And do you both think that he was trapped by the success of that, or did that enable him to do other things that perhaps were not as commercially successful or artistically treasured as these masterpieces?
I wouldn't dare say whether he was trapped, whether he felt trapped by it or not. He may have played into it. He may have appreciated it, but he was trapped by it. And he did, you know, because, I mean, I considered actually whether there was some way we might do both The Rat Trap and, you know, This Happy Breed from that same volume, plays that would show his facets. I mean, he wrote a searing play inspired by the war and the war effort, and you know, and he wrote, and he
the Second World War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he told a couple of stories of middle class life, you know, that and you do, there is a point where people say that's not what we want from you. And I mean, I tried very hard in the marketing material for The Rat Trap to there was this one line, is that you know more than a a fizzy martini, it's a thick stout, or something.
Yep.
Just so that to create the right expectation that you're not judging the play by how funny it is only. So of course it was hemmed in a way.
Alex, anything before I go to the next issue about Coward that I think is important?
No, I think Jonathan's quite right. I think just to quickly to add, he was phenomenally prolific, and over his lifetime, he wrote, I haven't got the numbers with me right now, but I certainly know he wrote over 400 songs. Yes. And he wrote all, and so there's something about where his prolific nature, and he was clearly a workaholic, and there was his dedication to his work clearly came at a great personal cost. And so it perhaps, as you say, the successes of the 30s perhaps contributed to this need, this desire to work, but also the urge internally as well as externally. Had the plays and the work of the 30s not been as successful, would he have felt the same motivation to work in the same extent he did? It's impossible to know, but it certainly opened doors to him in all the different aspects of his artistic output, whether it was his stint in Vegas or, you know, the sheer quantity of his output. But there's certainly, there could be an element of him feel the success being impossible to control at some point, or needing to be a beast needing to be fed.
There is a chapter of his life that has been a little bit addressed, and there have been biographies, and to some degree, I think he wrote 3 volumes of autobiography. He was a very important figure, but not a visible figure in the British war effort and the war effort in general in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And it became rather controversial. He worked for British intelligence in Paris, and the Germans created a book called the Black Book, as the translation, in which there are a list of people who lived in Britain who, if captured, were to be immediately killed. And one of them was Noël Coward. Among the others were Paul Robeson, an American who lived in Britain, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, and Virginia Woolf. And there were others. But it's just remarkable to me that Noël Coward, who our received wisdom is as this clever fellow in a dressing gown smoking a cigarette, would be that antithetical to the Germans because of his spying activities. And he worked for the United States until he fell a bit afoul of the American authorities, only in part was his homosexuality, which he didn't talk about, but it was very well known. But in large part because he was critical of America regarding its efforts in the war, when Britain basically was fighting it out alone before America finally joined the fight. But the king, I'm suddenly forgetting his name, Queen Elizabeth's father, was it George?
Yes, George
wanted to make him Sir Noël Coward at that time. Winston Churchill objected. And Winston Churchill, who was a friend of Coward's in a way, but Winston Churchill objected in part because of the gay issue, in part because of Coward's having offended certain Americans with his pronouncements, but also because he in effect said to Coward, you can help the war by entertaining the troops, not by doing what you're doing. And I think that Churchill I won't say didn't like, I never asked anyone, but clearly there was something about Coward's very professional efforts that had nothing to do with being a playwright or a composer for the war effort that ran afoul of Winston Churchill. Do either of you have thoughts about that or knowledge that I didn't fill in?
I don't have any knowledge of,
yeah.
Yeah.
Alex, as an Englishman, how do you feel about his activities in the war, the Second World War?
Well, I can't speak with any authority, but I do know that in 1940 he was in America to basically assess American attitudes to the war. And it's quite, I mean, the logical deduction would be that he was there to see whether or not he could do anything to influence America joining the war ahead of when America did join the war after Pearl Harbor. Because of course, once France surrendered and after Dunkirk, Britain was basically trying to get America to join the war as quickly as possible. And so he was certainly part of that attempt and that kind of general conversation.
And I do want to point out that he wrote a wonderful film, In Which We Serve, that won an honorary Oscar.
Right.
That was about the British Navy, and it was one of the films that people such as William Wyler produced in World War II and John Ford, that was about the heroic efforts either of the British or the Americans or others. But In Which We Serve was, I don't want to say unsentimental, but its sentiment was restrained, and it was about the reasons why we fight in certain causes. And again, that became Ibsen Shaw for me when I watch In Which We Serve, which is a beautiful film. And I need I think to add that to the body of work of Noël Coward that people sometimes forget about,
Right.
because there was all that.
Absolutely. There's a real understated patriotism to a lot of his work, and even an overt patriotism as well in much of his work as well. And he definitely was very proud to be British and to be English. But of course, there's a contemporary reassessment of some of that. It does have its own, it is problematic in its own way to in some of the discussions and his opinions on colonial and the empire and colonialism, for example. But certainly taken in and of its time, he was certainly I think quite an accurate barometer for the national mood over many years.
There's a parallel story that I always find very interesting, and namely the British composer Benjamin Britten, who happened to die not too long after Noël Coward, and their lives somewhat overlapped. Britten was born, I believe, I should know this, it was 1913 he was born, November 22nd, 1913. I know that because when they did a centennial concert at Carnegie Hall, I was the person who gave the lecture from the stage, so that's why the date sticks. But Benjamin Britten was also gay, or to use the word of the time, homosexual, and he lived openly with his partner, the tenor Peter Pears, and they left Britain in the 1930s in part because of the discrimination they faced in that regard. They lived in Brooklyn in a building known as the February House. I don't know if you know about that. And Jonathan, was a play called the February House a few years ago at the Public Theater.
Our friend Davis McCallum directed it.
Oh, okay. And this was a play about this house in Brooklyn where people such as Leonard Bernstein, Gypsy Rose Lee, the stripper, and ecdysiast, I forget the term now, of removing her skin, owned the house, and Carson McCullers was there, and all kinds of people, including Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, and Truman Capote briefly, who all lived there and created there. But when World War II broke out, Pears and Benjamin Britten, although they were conscientious objectors and pacifists and said they would not fight in the war as members of the military, got on a ship and went north to Canada and Iceland and landed in Liverpool and made their way down to southern England and spent the war years fighting the war by performing all around the United Kingdom, doing concerts and so on. And Britten wrote his opera, his most famous opera, Peter Grimes, which was the first opera to premiere after the war ended at the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden in 1945. And the parallel here is that both Coward and Britten, apart from being gay, lived the war very patriotically in their own ways.
Right.
And after the war, Benjamin Britten had something of an upward trajectory, mostly, and lived openly in his relationship. Coward did not necessarily he continued, as Alex said, to produce constantly a lot of work, but it was not always received as masterworks, and there were high points and lower points. And he had a partner named Graham Payne, who was a singer of South Africa, and apparently very handsome, but not industrious, to put it mildly. And Coward disapproved of Graham Payne's lack of initiative and work energy. But nonetheless, after Coward died in 1973 of a heart attack, Graham Payne lived another 20 years and took excellent care of Coward's affairs and his estate and the promotion of his work and so forth. But it's a long way of saying that the post-war era for Noël Coward was quite long, and he kept looking for relevance. This is my opinion. And Alex, you spoke about his Las Vegas years. Would you talk about that and and what it speaks about Noël Coward in the, I believe, late 50s, early 60s?
Well, my understanding, as you quite rightly point out, is that after the war, he sort of fell out of fashion for one reason or another, and that could partly because he was so ahead of his time and precocious and exciting and thrilling as a young man bursting onto the scene. But then as he aged, perhaps he was perceived to be a bit of a product of that time that had gone before.
You actually, I think it's fair to, I'm sorry to interrupt, Alex, but but in the 50s, everybody, all of the established playwrights were thrown out. The Terrence Rattigans and the J.B. Priestley and it ends up kind of getting, John Osborne gets blamed for the whole thing. Look Back in Anger was, in which Priestley himself was kind of specifically singled out as, get out of here. So the conventional playwrights who, were really thrown overboard. And,
right.
And so it's, I don't think you have to look too specifically at what happened to Coward, because it did happen to really lots of the English, maybe all of the English playwrights who had success in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
Yes, Alex, go ahead, please.
Well, there was linking it back to the Vegas years. What that did was expose him to a new generation of people and give him this wider, broader appeal that may be, as Jonathan notes, part of a broader cultural shift that was going on. But the fact that he had this residency in Vegas meant that a whole new generation, particularly of Americans, but of course of tourists, because Vegas being such a nexus for people from all around the world, this is before the truly globalized world that we now live in. So having a platform like a residency at Vegas was a kind of a way in which to disseminate his work, his personality, his style, and something about him being an English, the whole business of being an Englishman abroad, and the famous album cover to the LP of his Vegas residency was him in full black tie with a cup and saucer in the middle of the Nevada desert. And it's that kind of iconic imagery as well, that he was such a genius at curating himself. The image of Coward was as much a part of it as the words and music and plays of Coward.
He gradually, I think, understood that his physical health was not going to permit him to continue performing the way he did. He had heart disease. Even in his 60s, he had heart disease. And by 1966, he appeared in something called Noël Coward in 3 Keys in London, and was to bring it to New York, but got sick. And it was performed in New York with 2 of the 3 playlets, and I forget what it was called, but it starred Hume Cronin in the Noël Coward character. And he began doing cameos and small roles in movies. And his last film was called The Italian Job, which is a very nice caper movie, starring Michael Caine. And I won't give it away what Noël Coward's role is in this movie, but it was a very essential role in the movie. And he was very droll, but you could also, I could tell at least, that he was slowing down, and he knew that. And therefore, in his last years, I won't say he had dementia, but he couldn't remember his lyrics.
Right.
And, Frank Sinatra, when he performed late in his life, would have projected lyrics in front of him as a prompt if he forgot a line. But Noël Coward couldn't do that in a play. And perhaps in film he could do that and get away with it with retakes. But so he lived a lot of his life in Jamaica.
Right.
where he found a beautiful home called, I think, Firefly. I have to double check that. And many, many people came to visit him there. He also had a home in Les Avants in Switzerland, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. And I have a connection to all this because I was very fortunate to work a lot with Dame Joan Sutherland and with Richard Bonning, her husband, and they were Coward's neighbors in Les Avants and loved Noël Coward, and he loved them. And they were kind of like designed for living, the three characters. They were all very funny amongst themselves and amused one another, but were not performing for one another. They were just comfortable in their own skins with each other. And Sutherland in 1966 recorded a wonderful album of Noël Coward songs. And that's available at the Adagio catalog that you can listen to. And they provided, in a way, a home for him. And because I first worked with the Bonnings in 78 or 79, and they told me about him, and I visited them in Switzerland, and there was a wonderful collection of Noël Coward memorabilia, because Richard Bonning keeps everything and archives everything. And they told me about their visits to Jamaica and how special Jamaica was to him. And I did make a note for myself somewhere that among the people who visited were Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother as well, the Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, Sophie Loren, and his neighbors, Laurence Olivier, Sutherland and Bonning, and his neighbor was Ian Fleming, as in James Bond and all of that, as in spying and so on. And I can only wonder what they spoke about as two retired spies. So there is that. And Coward, when he died at Firefly in Jamaica and was with his partner. And his partner found his last poem, which begins, "When I have fears, as Keats had fears of the moment I'll cease to be, I console myself with vanished years, remembered laughter, remembered tears, and the peace of the changing sea." And apparently what Coward felt about Firefly, his home in Jamaica, was it was the place where he could write. He said, because very little else happens here. So it was the ideal place for him to write. So when both of you spoke about his industriousness and his desire to write and constantly produce, a lot of it did not happen in London. Maybe it happened a little in Les Avants, but primarily it happened in Firefly.
It's interesting, Fred, because in The Rat Trap, written when he was 19 or 8, whatever it was, the novelist Sheila writes on the Cornwall coast. That's where she's able to finally be productive. And
there is something about writers in the sea.
There certainly is.
Another one. Yeah.
There certainly is. It brings to mind Coward's famous song "Sail Away" from 1949. The first verse of which is, "When a sailor goes to sea, though he leaves his love behind, time and tide will set him free from the grief inside him. Sea and sky will ease his heart, regulate his troubled mind. Every sailor has a chart and a star to guide him home."
And now that we're on maritime subjects, one of his later successes was a musical called "Sail Away" that starred Elaine Stritch. And Elaine Stritch, in her one-woman show, speaks about her relationship with Noël Coward. And because that show is on video and perhaps audio as well, I recommend people go to that. Noël Coward was also a painter, and many of his paintings are in Firefly. He was a film director, he was a dancer, he was a singer, he was an actor, he was a director, he was a producer. I don't recall who wrote a tribute, who said that had Noël Coward been one thing, he would have been the greatest at it. but by doing 14 different careers, that there were better playwrights and better composers and better actors and better singers, but only one person who could do everything that Coward did and create this unique career. Jonathan, do you have any more Noël Coward coming?
No, you know,
Okay.
no. Coward, you know, it was exceptional that I chose to do Coward here, and because we could do the American premiere, but I do feel that others need the Mint's attention more than Coward.
So Alex, who is very fast in his research and probably has better Wi-Fi than I do in New York, sent me the quote. There are probably greater painters than Noël, greater novelists than Noël, greater librettists, greater composers of music, greater singers, greater dancers, greater comedians, greater tragedians, greater stage producers, greater film directors, greater cabaret artists, greater TV stars. If there are 12 different people. Only one man combined all 12 different labels, the master, and that was Lord Louis Mountbatten at a tribute at Noël Coward's 70th birthday party in 1969. Thank you, Alex.
I had that prepared, waiting for the apposite moment.
Okay. I'm sorry I stole it from you.
No, don't worry.
Alex, so what else do you want to work on regarding Noël Coward?
Oh, well, I'm hoping to be able to do more Coward. Absolutely. It tends to be tricky for young directors to get the rights to the more famous titles, which is one of the reasons why it was so exciting to do the Rat Trap, because it was public domain in the States. But I'm hoping that I might have the opportunity to direct some of his more, shall we say, robust scripts, because the Rat Trap, although brilliant, is flawed. It's part of the reason why it makes it so interesting to do. But I would love to do Private Lives, Designed for Living, The Vortex, but also some of the other titles that we've mentioned today and some of the ones we haven't, which are also fascinating and interesting and compelling, but not necessarily as well known. The back catalogue and the front catalogue are all very, very enticing.
Now, I know that
reasons.
you worked in opera because I looked you up, and Coward wrote 8 plays that have a lot of music. Some are called operettas. One of them, Bittersweet from 1929, he called an operetta. But there are certain other works that I count as operettas, for example, Countess Mitzi. And I'm wondering whether, because London, even now with the Sturm und Drang surrounding English National Opera, has smaller opera companies in the city and nearby, Garsington and places like that. Might it be time for an Noël Coward operetta to come back that you would direct?
I think that's a wonderful idea. Yes, okay. Definitely.
I'm putting this out into the ether because
yes,
right before the pandemic, I was working in London at the Royal Opera and had to fly home when the pandemic hit. So I've been here ever since, and I don't know when I'm getting back to London, but nonetheless, I think we've established, the three of us today, that Howard's work, beyond the famous masterpieces, which are masterpieces, merits a lot of consideration and visiting. I do want to give a shout out to something that Alex mentioned, because I think it's a wonderful institution that I'll ask you to talk about, the London Library, which is not the British Library near Euston Station. It is the London Library on St. James Square. And I did the research for 5 of my 10 books in the London Library, and I'm a member, and it's a wonderful institution. Alex, talk about the London Library, because it's a treasure, like the Mint Theatre.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
It's I might be wrong with some of this, but to my understanding, it's the oldest private members library in the world, founded in 1850 something, or perhaps a bit earlier or later, by the philosopher and philanthropist Thomas Carlyle. It has over 1 million printed works on open shelves, and and it's an oasis in central London, to read, to work, to borrow books. I was first introduced to it by Sam Walters, who ran the Orange Tree. And on my first visit, I knew that I wanted to become a member. Anyone can become a member. There's a subscription fee, but there's also a bursary scheme for academics, writers, artists, theatre makers who can't necessarily afford the full fees. And before COVID, they would, and a bit afterwards now, they're starting to do more and more events and performances and talks, and it's becoming an even richer cultural institution than merely a place for reading and writing, which of course is its primary function, and it there's no better place for that in
I
London.
mention this because in our digital world, we forget the power of an institution like the London Library or the Mint Theatre, because when we experience theatre at the Mint, it's live, it's communal, it's experienced the way theatre should be. And these institutions need our support, our engagement, and our belief in their missions. And with that, Jonathan, I want to ask you what's coming next to the Mint. I know, but I want you to talk about it.
Our next production, which will begin in February, and thanks for asking, Fred, it is really rather an exciting discovery of, so we're doing the world premiere of an unpublished, unproduced, obviously, play by Betty Smith, the author of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And if you're a lover of that book, you may remember that Francie Nolan always dreamed of becoming a playwright, and so did Betty Smith. And she wrote her first prose late in life, in her 50s, I think, or late 40s. And as she wrote that, and in her other novels, she describes in her autobiographical self the playwright. And this is a really terrific, compelling, gripping play called Becomes a Woman. As it happens, this was written in 1929-30. The leading character is a 19-year-old girl who turns 20 in the course of the play. Her name is Francie Nolan.
So minttheater.org.
Yes.
And theater is spelled the American way, the British way.
You'll get to our website if you spell it either way, but we do spell it the American way.
Very good. I thank both of you gentlemen for this wonderful conversation that we've had. And I admire both of your work a lot. Jonathan, I've occasionally chatted with you through the years when I've exited the Mint just to say thank you for this, but we never really had a conversation till now.
No.
And Alex, you and I exchanged one question at the performance I went to. So I was very happy that we could go deeper on Noël Coward. Both of you keep up the good work. I do want to tell listeners that as we approach the holiday season, my next guest is next week on December 23rd, is a magnificent organist for an important church in New York City. And I will leave it for now that you will discover who it is, but we will explore the organ and its mysteries and its capabilities that I think people don't necessarily know. I'll tell you his name, Paolo Bordignon. And I think it'll be a wonderful conversation. I wish everyone a way to find peace in the world. Noël Coward would have wanted that. I think we all want that. That should be our mission for the years to come and for always. Thank you both, and happy holidays, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you so much, Fred. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Cheers.